Forgotten Realms is one of the most popular settings in Dungeons & Dragons, and is certainly notable in fantasy in general. And while I appreciate much of its world building and the great creative mind of Ed Greenwood who gave us this setting, there is something that it, and much of D&D, does very strangely, and that's religion and gods. Think about how religion is usually represented in a typical D&D town, such as Baldur's Gate. You will have your lawful stupid paladins running around, smiting stuff, and your clerics healing the party in the wild, but in town you will likely have a few temples. Temples dedicated to, say, Helm, or Ilmater, or Soluna, or Bane in some places. Every one of those gods has their own churches, their own creed, their own exclusive priests and worshippers. But now look at what religion looked like in, say, ancient Greece. Sure, there were temples to Athena or Poseidon, and they had their own priests, but an average person wouldn't say they worshipped Athena exclusively. At home, they would have an altar to Hestia. When they needed good weather, they'd pray to Zeus, and if they were a thief who needed a good score, they'd pray to Hermes. And sure, D&D in the Older Deities book gave you an option for tight pantheons who don't have exclusive clerics, but this is the standard, and I also want to look at something else. This is Gary, Indiana, a small US town that came to mind first, with a map of the churches in town. If you check them out, you will find that most of them either belong to different denominations or don't have any stated greater allegiances. Because this is what religion looks like in America. People just call themselves Christian, meaning Protestant, and go to whatever church is the closest, or whichever church's pastor they agree with the most. So when I look at these two examples, I have to wonder, what of the strange way religion is reflected in D&D is just modern Americans' idea of what polytheism worked like, based on the religion they see at home? So what we are going to do is look at a couple of fantasy settings and see if they reflect the way the religion works at the writer's home. As usual, we have to start with Tolkien and his presentation of religion. What most people probably know is that John R.R. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. Though his stated goal with Hobbit and Lord of the Rings was to give Britain its own mythology, his own religion is very deeply reflected in his work. He creates his own cosmogony, his own story of the creation of the world, but it's a mirror of the Genesis account. Catholics don't usually believe the Bible is meant to be taken literally, so Tolkien just creates another metaphor for the same creation story. Here, God is called Eru Ilúvatar, and he creates the world with music, because Tolkien liked music, and he creates the angels and the earth through word. It's a very Catholic story. When we actually see the world on the ground, it looks far less Catholic on the surface, but when you really get into it, it's also a reflection of a Catholic worldview. Tolkien knew that if this story was real, it would be taking place before Jesus, before Moses, before Abraham. So he knew he couldn't just slap a mirror of the Catholic religion onto it. Unlike his friend C.S. Lewis, but that's a different story. The world we see is very non-religious. Religion just doesn't really come up, because Tolkien didn't want to make these people worship false gods. Because they were good people in his mind, and good people don't worship false gods. And the Revelations and the Covenants didn't come yet, so they couldn't be Jewish or Christian. It doesn't present a Catholic world, but it represents a Catholic view of the world. I'm not going to go deep into the Chronicles of Narnia because I never read them as a child and I don't want to make some egregious mistakes about it, but from what I understand, it was much more deeply Catholic in its presentation, Aslan being pretty much Jesus' persona. One of the biggest trendsetters and trope makers in fantasy these days is Dungeons and Dragons, of course. I already briefly touched on how religion is usually presented in D&D. You have these scattered temples of seemingly unassociated gods, and though they are sometimes bunched together in very loose pantheons, you don't really see the same interactions between these gods as you would between traditional historical pantheons. Mystra is sometimes cited as the head of the Forgotten Realms pantheon, or at least the most powerful one, discounting things like Overgod Ao. But you don't really see her marrying other gods, siring children who then run around and cause problems. You don't see her spawning a bunch of demigods by sleeping with mortals, and Gale in Baldur's Gate 3 in his story is very much unusual for D&D. Every god in D&D tends to exist in this weird self-contained bubble. Like I said, it seems that on-the-ground presentation reflects American Christianity, and the gods being so isolated stem from trying to extrapolate from the isolation of their churches. But does it reflect the religion of its creators? It's hard to speculate on that. Finding any solid sources on the religion of the original creators of the game itself and its oldest settings like Mystar or Greyhawk is surprisingly difficult, besides a very generic label of Christian Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson applied to themselves. Gygax at least was at least one point a Jehovah's Witness, but from other sources he didn't seem very strict about it. But if you know anything about American culture, it's that this wide generic Christian label usually reflects exactly what I described in the intro. Just the wide canvas of unassociated small churches. This is admittedly speculation to some degree, but they are American Christians and that's what I was looking for. Ed Greenwood's personal beliefs are even harder to nail, but though he is Canadian and religion in Canada is another topic, he was largely writing for an American audience and worked with plenty of American writers who would be influenced by their religious upbringing. Let's pivot to another setting I know well, and a setting I am a little closer to personally. The Witcher. Andrzej Sapkowski was not looking to make some big philosophical statement about religion when he wrote the books. The original short stories were largely his deconstruction of common fairy tales, with a protagonist that has a more gritty approach, a professional monster slayer and curse breaker. But perhaps in the process he created something that reflected the religion of his home. Much of the general Nordling pantheon is very similar to how it's represented in D&D. And yet another reason why I think Sapkowski saying he doesn't or didn't play RPGs is pure BS, but these kinds of things tend to seep through pop culture or osmosis. You read a book whose author was influenced by D&D and you subconsciously replicate their tropes. So seeing this very American approach to religion might make you think, well, The Witcher is a counterexample of this thesis. But there is something else in the setting that presents a better case. I present to you the Church of the Eternal Fire. Since they worship a fire and not any personal deity, one might think they are more Zoroastrian, but it's mostly a very superficial coat of paint. When you look at their garb, their habits, at the witch hunters they employ, at the role they end up having in the society, including the fat, corrupt priests, it's a reflection of how many people in Poland today, including the CD Projekt, who gave this church a much grander role, view the Catholic Church. Half the people are fanatically devout and would love to persecute the other half. And that other half may even be religious, but they just don't like priests. That is a common trope in Poland. Religious, but doesn't like organized religion. The Elder Scrolls were cut from the previous video for time, so I feel obliged to include a deeper analysis here. And I find that, at least before Oblivion, religion as presented in Elder Scrolls was a much better representation of an actual polytheistic society. In Morrowind, for example, you could join the Tribunal Temple, a local religion that is very different from the common pantheon. And for very real reasons, because the gods are actual physical beings who are present in the world who you can meet and kill. You could join the Imperial Cult, a cult that deified the Emperor and Tiber Septim, something that represented the actual religious practices in the Roman Empire. Or you could do quests for the Daedric Princes, who are not really demons, but they are the opposing family of gods in the same sense as the Asuras in India, or the Devs in Iran, or the Ajagun in Nigeria. But the biggest thing to talk about here is the Aedra, the gods of the setting. The Nine Divines are not actually the only Aedra, they are just the most popular ones that were canonized by, first, Saint Alessia and as the 8 Divines, and then Talos was added as the 9th. And if you look at the varieties of faith throughout the Empire, you will see that there are significant differences around the world. Not only do gods have different names, such as Akatosh, Alkosh, or Riel, they have different aspects, different creeds. Some races worship divines that do not appear in this main pantheon, such as Ifre or Ebon Arm or Shor, Shor and Shazar is a very interesting example because he's supposed to be a version of Lorcan, the trickster god who tricked the gods into making the world, and then got murdered for it. And then appeared in a bunch of myths anyway. And I'm not even going to get into the Kim and zero-sum stuff. That's like high-level esoteric Gnostic stuff. It's like a whole different topic. Like that's a whole different video about like Gnosticism and mysticism in fantasy video games and RPGs. But then comes Oblivion, and the Nine Divines had just a very Catholic-looking churches with priests that behaved like this Platonic idea of a Christian priest, and Oblivion was presented as uniformly hell-like because the Daedra gotta be demons. And then Skyrim made it even worse, but by making the Nords fight the Imperials to reinstitute the Imperial Pantheon instead of their own. Like, what the hell happened to the Nordic Pantheon over those 200 years? It's like if a mega-Israel empire defeated Christians and forced them to abandon Jesus, and then the Vikings fought the Christians to bring Jesus back. Like, how did that happen? My point here is, religion is one of the things that made the Elder Scrolls stand out so much because it was done so well, because it resembled the real world so little. And then they undid that, homogenized everything. The old version from before Oblivion reflected the education and literary influences of the writers. The new version is just generic fantasy Christianity or generic fantasy Norse pantheon. Only it's worse at being Norse than the old one. Religion in World of Warcraft is a weird one. It rarely comes up as a significant cultural influence. I can already hear some people saying, well, how can you say that when paladins and priests are such an important part of the setting? Well, paladins may be, but please tell me, what do those paladins believe in besides the light? What is the light anyway? What values does it represent? What are rites practiced by the religion? The truth is, we know very little about the actual religion. The churches look very Christian. They even have a few little fake cross symbols to represent their faith. They have priests that dress up in these Christian-coded get-ups, and the paladins are of course influenced by Western Crusader knights. This basic presentation looks very Catholic, but there are two aspects of the religion that do not align with that. For a religion that looks so Catholic on the surface, there is no pope, no high priests, no central authority of the religion. As far as we know, the church was fairly autocephalic, which means every kingdom's archbishop was independent from the others, and only responded to their king. You know what that resembles? The Church of England. The Holy Light is Anglican. But here's the last aspect of it. Though in Warcraft 1 there were scattered mentions of a god and angels, we never really see those things since then, like discounting the Naru, who are not a very different topic. Since the real world building started, the Holy Light became much more impersonal. They do say it loves you, but it's not a person with a name and a face, as far as we know. And also that it's a force that surrounds us and binds us, and that's the force from Star Wars. The Holy Light is the force from Star Wars if it was Anglican. I don't think anyone at Blizzard is quite that, or that it's even physically possible to be that. So I'll chalk it up to believing in comic books and Star Wars more than any religion. Any other religions on Azeroth are even less developed. The Draenei worship the light, but we learn very little about their actual practices and beliefs. They have paladins and they have priests and temples of the same impersonal light, so it seems like they both got inspired into making very similar religions by the Naru. Beyond that, Elune is often cited as the one true god of the Warcraft universe, and that may not even be true anymore with some of the recent lore additions that suggest Elune is something parallel to the Winter Queen from the Shadowlands, who is not that impressive. But again, we know very little about their actual religion besides the fact that they traditionally had female priestesses who liked to pick up bows, and they had druids who are pretty much the D&D druids, worshipping nature without going into too much detail or without trying to even remotely investigate actual real-world druidism. which is not all that much like our modern idea of druids, but that's a different topic again. So World of Warcraft is a very weird example that, much like early Elder Scrolls, goes much more into the literary influences than the society and religion the writers witness. I think that these examples show us a clearer picture than the analysis of racial diversity and fantasy settings did. I think that we can pretty much firmly divide these settings into three different categories. The settings written by either Catholics, or people who live in majority Catholic countries, that present religions and societies with heavy Catholic influence. The settings written by either Protestants, or people who live in majority Protestant countries, such as a lot of D&D settings, whose presentation of religion looks very American plus polytheism. And finally, settings written by either that are more heavily influenced by literary sources than any real-world religion they may have witnessed. So it seems like religion influences the writing more than any racial diversity of the real world. Are there any examples I missed that could change the conclusion? Settings written by Americans that look much more Catholic, or vice versa? Are there any good examples of interesting fantasy settings from modern polytheistic or other societies? From all my research into Indian fantasy, one written by Indian people, not Westerners interested in India, it all seems very heavily influenced by their actual ancient epics and their actual religion, more so than most Western fantasy. And perhaps someone can share more about how religion is represented in East Asian fantasy. I still don't feel quite ready to dive really deep into that topic because I haven't really consumed much East Asian media. So maybe someone who knows more can help us get started on that. Well, I think this is the end for today, and I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe and share any other aspects of culture and their representation in fantasy you might want to see me take a look at in future videos. Also, we have a new channel member who goes by KC Kelly, and I'll skip the numbers, so thank you to KC Kelly, and of course my usual general supporters. Here, I should be somewhere on the screen, if I don't forget. Who go by Space Cat or Blowrocker Choga, that's like a set 2 layers pun. Or Reiji Akamatsu, who continue to support the channel through other means. Maybe we'll skip the poll after this one, since people already seem to have voted for the Forgotten Races of 4th edition D&D, but we'll see what it looks like by the end of the week. Meanwhile, this is it for today, and my dear hamsterlings, I hope to see you next time.